One in the Chamber by Nicholas fucking Woodman.
Jackson awoke in a bare, windowless room. The walls, ceiling, and floor were of pure concrete, gray and cold. A dim light bulb fixed in the center of the ceiling was the only source of light. A coarse wooden table and 2 middle folding chairs were the only furnishings. On the back wall hung a small white clock, ticking loudly with each movement of its second hand. He was seated in one of the folding chairs, facing the clock. Across from him sat a man. He wore a brown tweed hat and suit, and a red tie knotted in a half Windsor. All of his features were a hazy black, translucent like a frosted glass window. He had no discernible eyes, nose, or mouth. Resting on the table between both parties was a loaded Smith & Wesson. The barrel of the gun was pointed away from both parties. Jackson was too confused to speak. He had not expected to end up here. He looked at the shadowy figure expectantly, hoping that he would speak, but the figure remained silent. He waited for the figure to move, but that, too, was futile. The room sat still. The only noise was the ticking clock and a low, monotonous hum coming from the light bulb. Jackson finally gathered enough energy to speak. "Where am I?" he asked.
The Chamber,
the figure replied, after a pause. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. "Why am I here?" The figure laughed.
You know exactly why.
"No," Jackson said indignantly. "I don't."
What's the last thing you remember?
Jackson's face flushed. Suddenly ashamed, he couldn't find it in himself to speak. He turned away from the figure.
Don't be shy,
the figure continued.
Speak.
Jackson took a deep breath. He spoke deliberately. "I was in my room. Nobody was home. I was feeling low. And there was a bottle of pills sitting on my dresser."
You overdosed.
The figure interrupted. "Yes."
You woke up here.
"Yes." Jackson turned back towards the figure. "Why?"
When you attempt to take your own life, one of 3 things can happen. The first is, obviously, that you fail. In that case, you go on living, as you normally would have. Perhaps changed by the experience, perhaps not. The second is that you succeed, and are 100% certain that you are making the right choice. In that case, you go on to your own constructed afterlife, whatever that may be. The third is where I come in.
The figure paused momentarily for effect, sweeping his hand around the room in a dramatic gesture.
You were sent to this room because you expressed doubts about taking your own life, whether you were consciously aware of those thoughts or not. I'm here to provide you with a second chance. If you wish to die...
On cue, the pistol rose up from the desk and rotated itself so that its barrel was eye level with Jackson.
Place the pistol in your ear and pull the trigger. There's only 1 bullet in the chamber, but I can assure you that you will not miss. If, of course, you wish to live. Please place the pistol back on the desk. You will wake up in your room slightly dazed, but otherwise intact.
Jackson contemplated this for a second. "If I wake up," he asked, "will my parents know?"
They will be none the wiser. For all they know, when they came home, you were fast asleep. Of course, if you pull the trigger, they'll find you dead the next morning.
Jackson glanced at his palms and realized they were sweating. I don't remember having any doubts," Jack stammered.
Ah, but you did,
the figure replied. The wall in front of Jackson shimmered. Before he could react, the gray concrete turned transparent. He could see his room, clear as day, as though he were looking at a large bay window.
Come,
said the figure. He held out his hand. Instinctively, Jackson grabbed it, letting the figure lead him to the wall. Jackson was sitting on his bed, hands resting on his chin. He looked out the window. It was an overcast November day. The large oak tree in his backyard, already sick, was barren of leaves. A single red sparrow flew onto his windowsill, looked into his room, chirped, and flew away. His phone buzzed. He checked his texts. In an instant, he flew into a rage, throwing his phone against the back wall of his room. It landed on the wooden floor with a crash. Dazed, he lifted himself off of his bed and retrieved his phone. The screen had shattered. He placed the phone where it had landed on the floor, as though he had decided that this particular spot was where his phone was meant to be all along. He opened his bedroom door and checked its house. It was silent. Satisfied, he walked into his kitchen and grabbed a cup from the dishwasher. He walked into the bathroom and filled the cup with water. He walked back into his room and shut the door. From the top of his dresser, he retrieved a small bottle of pills. He swallowed the entire bottle with the water from his cup. His hand trembled as he placed the pills in his mouth. When the deed was done, he lay down on his bed and closed his eyes. The wall turned back into concrete. The figure led him by the hand back into his seat.
"Your hand troubled,"
said the figure. Jackson said nothing.
"That's why you're here.
The figure continued, conclusively.
And now it's your turn to try again."
Jackson began to sweat.
"It's your decision. Should you choose to try again, your family will find you dead the next morning. The friend who sent you that text should find out by noon, give or take. Everyone else will find out soon after."
Jackson reached towards the gun, then pulled his hand back.
"This is your last chance."
Jackson trembled. His face was as red as the figure's tie. Beads of sweat ran down his face and landed with a loud drip on the concrete floor. He stared at the figure, but the figure said nothing more. The clock on the wall continued to tick. With each passing second, the ticks appeared to grow louder and louder. The figure stared in silence, watching Jackson's every move. Jackson reached for the gun and put it to his ear. He rested his finger on the trigger, but he couldn't push it any further. The gun was to his ear only for a minute, maybe for 2, but to Jackson it was his first glimpse of eternity. With a scream, he removed the gun from his ear and threw it on the table. Jackson woke up with a start. He rolled over and looked at the clock in his room. It was 5:30 a.m. His alarm would ring for school in an hour. He looked toward his window. The sun was rising, and just for a fleeting moment he could swear that he saw a slim black shadow looking in from outside. It took Jackson 15 minutes before he could bring himself to cry.